Hey everyone, ready to dive deep into free will. Have you ever wondered if you're really the one making the choices or if you're just kind of along for the ride?
Yeah, it's a question that's been around forever. What does it even mean to have free will?
Exactly. And to help us figure that out, we're going to look at two really interesting sources. We've got Free Will, a very short introduction by Thomas Pink, who's a philosopher,
Yeah.
and then Free Will by Sam Harris, who comes at it from a neuroscientific perspective.
So two very different perspectives on the same, fundamental question.
Totally. So Pink kind of takes us on this journey through history, showing how ideas about free will have evolved over time.
Hmm.
And it's super interesting how early on, free will was tied up with religion. Like, your will was this divine gift that separated humans from animals.
Right.
And if you did something bad, it was because your will chose to do it, so you were held accountable.
Makes sense. I mean, that idea is still around today, right? Like in our legal systems and stuff.
Oh, absolutely. But Pink points out that even way back then, medieval philosophers were grappling with some tough questions.
Yeah.
Like, if God already knows everything that's going to happen, including all our choices, does that mean our actions are already predetermined?
Yeah. That's a tough one. Where does free will fit in if, a higher power is calling the shots?
Right, it's a real head scratcher.
Totally.
Okay, but let's fast forward a bit.
All right.
Pink introduces us to Thomas Hobbes, this philosopher from the 1600s who really shook things up.
Uh-oh.
He argued that humans are basically just complex animals driven by their desires.
So no more special human will.
Yeah, he kind of downplayed that whole idea of the will as this separate, special thing.
Interesting.
So then, are our choices just a chain reaction of desires?
I mean, that's a big question, right? And this is where the whole idea of determinism comes in.
Determinism?
Yeah, the idea that all our actions are caused by things that happened before. So if everything we do is just a result of something else, are we really free?
Whoa, okay, so if everything is determined, does that mean we're all just dominoes falling in a pattern that's already set? That doesn't sound very free to me.
Right. It's kind of tricky. And that's where Sam Harris and the idea of compatibilism come into play.
Compatibilism, yeah, the idea that free will and determinism can actually coexist.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, Harris brings up a really powerful and disturbing example, the murders of the Petit family.
Oh, wow. That's a heavy one.
Yeah. It's a really tough case to think about, but it forces us to face some uncomfortable questions about moral responsibility.
I can see that.
I mean, on the surface, we tend to see criminals as just evil people who consciously chose to commit these horrific acts.
Right.
But when you start to dig into the potential causes of their behavior, like their genetics, their upbringing, maybe even brain abnormalities, things get much more complicated.
So you're saying, if we could trace every action back to a specific cause, would we still view someone as fully responsible for their actions?
It's a question that compatibilists wrestle with,
Yeah, that makes you think.
because they're saying that even our unconscious processes, the things we're not aware of, are still part of who we are.
So even if we don't realize it consciously, are those unconscious influences pulling the strings?
Well, compatibilists wouldn't necessarily say they're pulling the strings, but they'd say our understanding of conscious control is too simplistic.
Okay.
It's not like there's this separate little me inside making decisions independently of everything else.
I see. So it's all connected.
Yeah, our conscious experience is a product of a whole bunch of factors, many of which are happening below the surface.
Gotcha. But doesn't that clash with how we experience ourselves? When I decide to grab my coffee, it feels like I'm making that choice.
Sure, and compatibilists acknowledge that subjective experience.
Mm-hmm.
But they're saying there's more to the story. Just because something feels like a conscious choice doesn't mean it isn't also influenced by a whole chain of prior causes.
Okay. But this is where I get tripped up. If everything ultimately stems from something else, how can we really hold anyone accountable for their actions? Does compatibilism just let everyone off the hook? It does make you wonder, doesn't it? If we toss out this traditional idea of free will, then how do we deal with responsibility? Does compatibilism just say, okay, everyone's off the hook?
Well, it's not so much about letting people off the hook. It's more about Harris actually addresses this directly. He's saying that even if we ditch this classic idea of free will, there's still a practical reason to have consequences for actions.
Okay, so even if we can't blame people in the traditional sense, there's still a societal benefit to having repercussions for harmful actions.
Exactly. Think about it this way. Even if you don't buy into the traditional free will thing, you can still see that people respond to incentives, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So holding people accountable, even if it's, as Harris puts it, this kind of sham retribution, can actually deter crime and protect innocent people.
Interesting. So we're shifting away from a blame-focused system to one that's more focused on consequences.
You could definitely see it that way. It's less about punishing someone for making a bad choice and more about having a system where harmful actions have clear consequences.
Okay, so that kind of makes sense. But then what happens to our sense of justice? Does that just disappear?
That's a really good point. And Harris gets into that too. He suggests that our desire for retribution, that urge to see someone suffer for doing something wrong, often comes from this belief in free will, right?
Yeah.
Like they chose to do it, so they deserve to be punished.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you let go of that free will idea, that thirst for revenge might actually lessen.
Whoa, okay. So are you saying we just forgive everyone, no matter what they've done?
Not necessarily. Forgiveness is a whole other can of worms.
Yeah.
And often that's more about the victim's healing than about what the perpetrator deserves.
Mhm.
But what Harris is getting at is that if you understand the factors that contributed to someone's behavior, their past, their brain, all of that, you might actually feel more compassion. Instead of seeing criminals as just plain evil, you might start to see them as products of their circumstances.
So it's less about hate and more about understanding where they're coming from.
Yeah, exactly. And that understanding could lead to more effective ways to actually prevent crime and help people who have committed crimes.
This sounds like Harris is suggesting a pretty major overhaul of, like, our whole criminal justice system.
Oh, absolutely. He believes our current system is based on these outdated ideas about free will and moral responsibility.
Huh.
He envisions a system that's focused more on rehabilitation, reducing harm, and addressing the root causes of crime.
Definitely gives you a lot to think about. But let's switch gears a little bit.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier that Pink also digs into the nature of action. Is he saying the same thing as Hobbes, that we're just driven by desires?
Not entirely. So, while he acknowledges Hobbes' influence, Pink offers another way to understand action.
Huh.
One that isn't just about those pre-existing desires. He calls it a practical reason-based theory of action. And it puts our ability to reason at the forefront.
So it's like we can actually think things through and make choices based on logic, not just on what we want in the moment.
Precisely. Pink is arguing that we as humans don't just blindly follow every desire. We can think about our goals, consider different options, and make decisions for specific reasons.
Makes sense. But how does all of this connect back to the free will thing? Does using our reasoning somehow give us more freedom?
Well, if we can act based on reasons instead of just being puppets to our desires, that does make the question of freedom more interesting.
Okay.
Maybe our choices aren't just totally predetermined by our desires or random chance. Maybe our ability to reason gives us a real ability to guide our actions.
So even if our desires are pulling us in one direction, our reasoning can step in and change course.
Exactly. It's not this simple either-or situation. Pink's theory suggests it's this more complex interplay between desires, reasons, and actions. And this opens up the possibility for a kind of freedom that isn't just randomness or being controlled by cravings.
You know, this reminds me of that earlier question about God knowing the future. If God knows what we're going to do, doesn't that mean our choices are already set in stone?
Ah, yes. The classic dilemma. But Pink brings up an interesting idea here. Agent causation.
Agent causation.
Yeah, it's a bit of a head-scratcher, but imagine it this way. Your free will, if it exists, could operate outside the normal chain of cause and effect.
Wait, really?
It's not that your choices are uncaused, but that the cause is you, acting as this unmoved mover.
So we're not just like dominoes falling one after another. There's something more to it.
That's the idea. Agent causation suggests that we, as agents, have this unique ability to initiate action without being totally determined by everything that came before. It's a way to reconcile freedom with a universe that might be predetermined.
I have to admit, this is getting pretty deep. Does Pink give any real-world examples of how this agent causation actually works?
It's a tough one to pin down. Even Pink admits it's kind of a philosophical mystery.
Okay.
But he argues that it's the best explanation for that feeling of freedom that we intuitively feel like we have.
Well, maybe we're not just puppets on strings after all. Maybe there's a spark of real choice in there somewhere.
Maybe. But even if we accept some level of freedom, there's still the question of moral responsibility, right?
Right.
Like if things outside our control are influencing our actions, how much can we really be held accountable?
It brings us back to that core question, doesn't it? Are we responsible for who we are and what we do, or are we just products of our biology and environment?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's the million-dollar question, nature versus nurture. And Pink acknowledges that the way we normally think about moral responsibility relies on the idea that we genuinely control our actions. But he also points out that our experience of agency, that feeling of being in control, can be misleading. We might feel like we're making choices even when things we're not aware of are heavily influencing our actions.
It's like when I absent-mindedly eat an entire bag of chips without even thinking about it.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
can be driven by unconscious desires, habits, even quirks in your brain, and still feel like you're the one in charge. So the question becomes, how do we square that subjective experience of free will with the possibility that we're not as free as we think?
Yeah, that's the challenge, isn't it? Is King saying that our sense of moral responsibility is just an illusion? Like we're tricking ourselves into thinking we have more control than we do?
Not necessarily. He explores the idea that our ability to reason and reflect might be key to moral responsibility.
Okay.
It's not just about whether something caused our actions, but also whether we used our reasoning powers when making those choices.
So if I really think through my options, weigh the consequences, and then decide based on logic and reason, I'm more morally responsible than if I just act impulsively.
That's the general idea.
Mm.
Pink's arguing that our ability to reason lets us take a step back from those immediate desires and consider the moral implications of what we're doing. And it's that capacity for reflection that makes us truly responsible agents.
This makes me wonder about the whole we are what we repeatedly do idea. If our habits and tendencies are so ingrained, how much freedom do we have to actually change? Are we just stuck in these patterns?
That's a great question, and it's something that both Pink and Harris address, although from different angles.
Okay, I'm curious. What are their takes on breaking free from habits?
Well, Harris, with his background in neuroscience, emphasizes the power of unconscious processes. He's saying that our brains are constantly shaping our thoughts and actions, often without us even realizing it.
Okay.
Our habits, biases, even our core beliefs are the result of everything we've experienced and all the neural conditioning that's happened over time.
So are you saying we're basically on autopilot most of the time?
In a way, yeah. But Harris doesn't see this as, like, a gloomy or depressing thing. He says that recognizing the limits of our conscious control can be liberating.
How so?
It frees you from that illusion of the self
Yeah.
and lets you focus on what you can actually change.
I'm not sure I follow. If we're just puppets to our brains, what's the point of even trying to change?
Harris's point is that while you might not have total control over your thoughts and feelings, you can still influence them.
I see.
You can change your habits, reframe how you look at things, and create environments that support your goals. He talks about things like meditation, mindfulness, cognitive therapy, all these tools to help reshape those neural pathways and make positive changes.
So it's less about brute force willpower and more about working with our brains, understanding how they work.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about recognizing that, yeah, we may not be the authors of our thoughts and feelings in the way we usually think, but we can be the editors.
I like that. But what about Pink? How does his view on habit and change compare to Harris's?
Well, Pink, unlike Harris, who's focusing on those unconscious processes, really emphasizes the role of reason and reflection. He argues that our ability to reason lets us step back from those ingrained habits and consciously choose who we want to be.
So it's less about rewiring our brains and more about flexing our willpower muscles, making that conscious effort to break free.
In a way, yes. Pink is saying that your capacity for reason gives you this leverage over your desires and habits. You can use your reasoning to figure out what values are most important to you and then make the choice to align your actions with those values.
This is starting to sound like a self-help book.
Huh. Well, there's definitely a self-improvement aspect to both Pink and Harris's perspectives.
Yeah, I can see that.
They both emphasize the importance of making conscious choices and taking responsibility for our actions, even if they acknowledge that our free will has limits.
So we can't just say, oh, well, my brain made me do it. We still got to own our choices, even if they're influenced by things we don't totally control.
Exactly. Both Pink and Harris are saying that even if we don't have this absolute perfect free will, we still have a responsibility to try to be the best versions of ourselves. No, we can't just resign ourselves to being controlled by our brains.
This has been quite the mind-bending conversation. We've gone from medieval philosophy to modern neuroscience, from the power of desire to the importance of reason. It's no wonder free will is such a tough nut to crack.
Absolutely. It's been a puzzle for centuries, and there's no easy answer. But I think what matters most is not necessarily finding the right answer, but just engaging in the conversation and exploring these different viewpoints.
I'm with you on that. But before we wrap things up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about the illusion of the self. What did you mean by that?
Oh, yeah. That's a key part of Harris's argument, and it's something that people often miss in these free will discussions.
Okay.
He's saying that our sense of self, that I, that feels like it's making the decisions, is actually a construct of our brains.
Wait, are you saying that I don't exist?
It's not that you don't exist, but the you think you are is a lot more complex and fluid than you might realize.
Okay.
Harris uses this analogy of a wave. Like a wave has a shape and it moves, but it's not really separate from the ocean, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's just this temporary expression of the water itself.
So I'm like a wave just bobbing along in the ocean. But if I'm the wave, then what's the ocean?
That's where it gets really mind-blowing. Harris says that the ocean is the whole set of causal factors that create your experience. It's your genes, your environment, your upbringing, even all those random things that have happened in your life. All of that comes together to create the wave of consciousness that you experience as me.
This is making my head spin. But I think I'm kind of getting it. If the self is just an illusion, does that mean we're not really individuals?
That's a question that Harris really grapples with, and he admits it can be a tough one to accept. He doesn't deny the importance of individuality, but he's saying that the way we usually think about it is too rigid, too self-contained.
So we're more connected than we realize.
Yeah. He's suggesting that you're more interconnected than you realize, and your sense of self is constantly being shaped by your interactions with the world around you.
This makes me think about consciousness in general. If the self is an illusion, what does that mean for how we experience the world?
That's a deep one, and it's something that philosophers and scientists are still trying to figure out.
Yeah.
Harris argues that your experience of the world is ultimately coming from your brain. Your senses take in information, your brain processes it, and boom, you have a conscious experience. But he also admits that we still have a lot to learn about how consciousness actually works.
This is all pretty mind-blowing. I'm starting to see how letting go of the idea of free will can totally change how you see yourself and the world.
It's a huge shift in perspective.
Yeah.
But like I said before, it's not necessarily about finding the definitive answers. It's more about engaging with the questions and considering these different viewpoints.
Totally agree. Well, this has been quite a deep dive into some pretty profound questions. A lot to chew on.
I agree. We've explored how the free will debate has evolved over time, looked at compatibilism, and even touched on the nature of consciousness itself. Quite a journey.
It really has been. But before we go, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder.
Okay.
We've talked about the limits of free will, the influence of those unconscious processes, and the possibility that the self is an illusion. But even if all of that is true, you still experience the world in a very real, immediate way. You feel joy, you feel sorrow, you make choices, you experience the consequences.
Right.
So even if free will is an illusion, what does that tell us about the nature of that illusion? Is it just a meaningless trick of the mind, or is there something more to it? Something that could help us understand who we are and what it means to be human? I think that's something worth thinking about.
It really is.
Yeah.
Even if it's like rooted in something we're still trying to figure out.
You know, it's interesting. After all that, something Pink says toward the end really stayed with me. He talks about how maybe this whole freedom thing is more about our ability to reason practically than about some mystical force of will.
Ah, yeah. That's an important point. It's fascinating how Pink connects freedom to our ability to think things through, like really weigh our options and make choices based on solid reasons, not just on whims or whatever we're craving.
Totally. It flips the script on how we normally think about free will. Instead of it being this magical power to defy cause and effect, it's about understanding why we do what we do, and then using that knowledge to make choices that match what we truly value.
Exactly. And when you think about the implications for society, that's when things get really interesting.
How so?
Well, if freedom hinges on our ability to reason, maybe it's less about individual liberty as the ultimate goal, and more about building a society where people can think critically, understand the impact of their actions, and engage in, genuine, thoughtful debates.
Whoa, okay, so we're not just talking about, choosing coffee over tea. We're talking about a whole different approach to social and political issues.
Exactly. It's a major shift in thinking. And if we accept that our ability to reason is so central to freedom, then we have to really think about how to cultivate that ability, both in ourselves and in others.
It makes me think about how divided things feel these days. Everyone's so polarized, just trying to shout each other down. If pink's right and our freedom depends on our ability to reason, are we headed in the wrong direction?
It's a worrying thought. It seems like we've lost sight of how important reasoned debate is for a healthy society.
Yeah.
We're so caught up in our own little bubbles, our own ideologies, that we've forgotten how to actually listen to each other, consider different perspectives, and find some common ground.
So, what's the takeaway here? If we want to protect our freedom, we need to get better at having productive, reasoned conversations.
I think that's a huge part of it. We need to move past those simplistic black and white arguments and learn to have more nuanced, thoughtful discussions.
Yeah.
We need to be open to challenging our own assumptions, hearing other points of view, and recognizing that sometimes there isn't just one right answer.
This has been a lot to take in. We've barely scratched the surface of this whole free will thing.
Definitely. But hopefully this has given you a good foundation to explore further. It's about asking the right questions and being open to the possibilities.
I agree. And we've left you with some big questions to think about. What does it really mean to be free? How do we nurture that capacity for reason? And how does that ability contribute to building a just and flourishing society?
Important questions for all of us to consider, both individually and together.
Well said. And on that note, we'll let you continue your own exploration into this whole free will mystery.
Keep those minds open and keep asking those questions.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time.